Hi, I'm Jim McCann, founder of 1-800-Flowers. We created this podcast to share the wonderful people we get to interact with, we get to meet, we get to know, and most importantly, get to learn from. So I invite you to join us on this journey here on the Celebrations Chatter podcast. Hi, I'm Jim McCann, and I'm one of the co-authors of Lodestar. I had the good fortune recently, that is at the very beginning of COVID, to meet my friend Dr. George Everlys. George, a little bit about your background.
Grew up in a little town outside of Baltimore, Maryland. It was called Catonsville. And I used to call it Leave It to Beaverville because I just couldn't imagine a better place to grow up. There was just a supportive community there. And I didn't know how important that was. In fact, I probably took that for granted. Went to college because that's what my father said to do, and that's what we kind of were expected to do in the neighborhood. But then when I graduated from college, I didn't really know what to do. I got a business degree.
Because your dad was in business.
Because my dad was a finance guy, yeah. And thought, well, what do you do when you graduate and you don't know what to do? You go to graduate school.
Makes sense.
The problem was my grades weren't great. So I had to apply a number of places, fortunate enough to get into a master's degree program. And then all of a sudden, I got bitten by the bug of curiosity. Mm-hmm. And I was just curious about all the things I didn't know about. And I thought, wow, this graduate school and learning is a really nice thing. But I wanted to learn more than just business. So then I went into public health. Even though I didn't have all of the qualifications, mm-hmm. I was fortunate enough to be admitted to a public health program. Graduated from that, studied neuroscience. I was fascinated with how the brain would work. And I was even more lucky to have studied the part of the brain that ultimately would be identified as the center of the stress response. Little did I know that stress was going to be something that was going to become ubiquitous. It would become epidemic-like. Uh-huh. And I'd written one of the first books on it. So then I went back to school and became a clinical psychologist. And now I look at the world through two lenses. The one of a public health scholar, the other is a clinical psychologist. But always trying to find how to make the world just a little bit better.
Along the way, George, you became an expert in stress. You became an expert in public crises. How we as people individually and as communities and as cultures respond to dramatic situations of stress. You became expert in PTSD. How did that path of curiosity lead to you being one of the more foremost experts on our reaction to major stress situations?
I wish I could say it was because I was prescient. I could see what was happening in the future, but I just followed a principle called happenstance, which is prepare yourself for the opportunities you don't know are there. So I studied a part of the brain that would be identified as the center of post-traumatic stress disorder. So when the diagnosis was actually made in 1980, turned out that I knew a lot about the diagnosis without knowing a lot about the diagnosis. I knew about the underlying physiology. So then people would come to me and say, well, that's fine, but what do we do about it? And that changed my study, that changed my clinical orientation. And so I wanted to study people who had been through adversity. I wanted to study those who did well and those not so much, and see the difference and see if we could teach them the difference. And that led me to 41 countries on 6 continents. And I've been in some ways blessed, and I don't know whether cursed at the same time or not, but I've been eyewitness, boots on the ground, for the events that have hallmarked the last 50 years and will probably shape the next 50 years.
So you're a clinician, you're a scientist, and you study the neuroscience of the brain and how we respond to stress, which caused you to go down the path. Some of the stress situations you followed have been current, like you were there, boots on the ground when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and to study how they handled the stress of that, the Kuwaitis. You were on the ground in Japan after the nuclear reactor meltdown to see how that community responded to stress. But you weren't just measuring. You went on to, after I discovered you in my world, 4 years ago, I went to look at some of your other work, and I was really blown away by what you did at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, the Bloomberg School of Public Health, when you developed the psychological first aid kit that you teach emergency responders how to use for themselves and for the people they encounter.
So every house should have a physical first aid kit. What we don't appreciate is there's always a psychological consequence to a physical injury. And sometimes there's a psychological consequence to not even being injured, but being close to injured, being a witness to others being injured. So if there's a physical first aid kit, why shouldn't there be a psychological first aid kit? So all of a sudden, we thought that it might be nice to teach core principles to anyone. Anyone that can learn physical first aid can learn psychological first aid. So we came up with that first aid kit. It became very popular. The university put it on a learning platform called Coursera, and over 530,000 people have taken the class. I don't know whether that says something good about the curriculum or it says something about where the world is headed, Jim.
In Lodestar, George, we tried to look at the essence of everything that went into the self-help books that we've all read, appreciated. Some have been life-changing, others have been things we'll quickly forget. So we tried to create a guide here with your work and your science about what were the common themes in all of these self-help books, personal development books. Because in my life, in your life, we and everyone we know, most everyone we know, wants to be better. Whether they're 6 or like us, 106, we still are looking to be a better form of ourselves. Tell me, what's your impression, George, of the self-help category and how we tried to go about organizing it to give people a guide to the best of?
So before we jump in, I just want to get the timelines correct, though, Jim. My mother was very appreciative the days you used to babysit for me, so I just want to make sure that people know that we're talking about two different frames of reference. But the idea of wanting to be a better person, I think, goes all through human history, at least written human history. If you want to go back to what probably are the first self-help books, maybe.
Bible?
Thank you. Yeah. The religious scriptures, not just the Christian Bible, but other scriptures as well. And then we go and we think through history. We take a look at ancient Greece and the Iliad and the Odyssey. Mm-hmm. Most people think of those as war stories or adventures, but they're also powerful messages of how to live your life, what to do and what not to do. And then we...
Maybe I shouldn't have spent so much time on Dantes Inferno.
Exactly. Where do you want to spend the rest of eternity? And you go through history, Jim, and it's just fascinating. The Harvard sociologist George Santayana said, those who fail to read history are doomed to repeat it. Mm-hmm. And I see that happening over and over again. But if that is true...
How does that apply in the self-help personal development world?
Exactly. So how does that apply? And the answer is maybe there are themes that are simply being repeated. Maybe there's a core wisdom there that are it's just being repackaged, mm-hmm. called different things. And we think, therefore, it's different. When we cut down and we remove the packaging, we say, wait a minute, this is the same theme that they were talking about 2,000 years ago. So what we've tried to do is distill them, identify them for the reader, and say, no, you don't have to read 2,000 years of literature or 85,000 self-help books. We've done that for you.
So we tried to create the Cliff Notes version of each of those, what we identified as 10 tenets of personal development, of growth, of being the best person you could.
And it seems overly simplistic, doesn't it, to say we've distilled it down to 10. And there are many variations on these themes, but there are 10 core things that if people could just implement half of them, they would be a different person.
One of the things we talked about first was the optimist. Mm-hmm. Having an optimistic attitude, how attitude is so important to how we approach life, how we live life, how we enjoy life or not. And so we talked about some real world examples. And I have a friend, Bob Diamond. Bob is a very successful banker, leader. He worked at Morgan Stanley for many years around the world, a lot of time in Asia, lived in Japan. Then he ran Barclays Bank, the largest European bank. And then he created a private equity firm that I'm privileged to be involved with and invested in called Atlas Merchant Capital. Bob's nickname is and has been for 20 years the Optimist, because he's always optimistic. But I find in my life, George, that the people you most want to be around are optimists. It's tough to be around with a pessimist. Glass is half full, life is terrible, it's never going to get better. They just exhaust you. And we'll gravitate to people who have an optimistic vision of what can be, because more often than not, they can influence the outcome because they know it can be better and they work toward making it a better, good situation.
What's interesting from the neuroscience world, we learned that about 20% of people are born optimistic.
Only 20%, huh?
Yeah, and 80% are born somewhat pessimistic. In other words, they're likely to see the threats rather than the opportunities. And that translates. And you say, well, why is there such an imbalance? It was probably life-saving back in the days when there were dinosaurs and the like. But today, not so much. We learned that attitude is so critically important. But that's been echoed again. Let me go back in history. The mind is its own self. And it in itself can make a heaven of a hell or a hell of a heaven. And that's what we do. 20% find the opportunities. 80% find something else.
Yes. So can we train our brains, George? I think that you've changed your brain. You said every experience we have is changing our brain. And every thought we have is changing our brain. So if our thoughts are 80% negative, we're training our brain to think and behave and anticipate the negative. For those 20% who were born optimistic, they're training their brain in the opposite direction. So is the divide between those who see the possible and those who see all the things that can go wrong, is that gap widening by training our brains in different directions?
Clearly, every time you think something, Jim, every time you do something, you're training your brain to be better at it.
Yes.
But you can change your thoughts. And that's the good news. So
you can become a better pessimist.
Well, the more you practice, the more you worry, the better you become at worrying. I was not a great student, and I didn't understand why. Later, I would discover that I had a syndrome called dyslexia, where you have difficulty reading, and I was also ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And when I was growing up, it was just, George just isn't that smart. I mean, he's a nice guy, but he's just not that smart. My parents knew there was something not quite right, but they emphasized the positive. They wouldn't let me dwell on the negative. So in 10th grade, my father is summoned to the guidance counselor's office. Oh, you don't want to get that call.
You're in trouble.
Yeah. And he said, Mr. Everly, take your son out of high school. He will never graduate. And if he does graduate, he'll certainly never go to college. My father told me that story only when I finished my first doctoral training. I said, Dad, why didn't you tell me that? He said, I didn't want it to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So sometimes what we don't know can help us. But the good news is that you're talking about neuroplasticity, and that's the concept that every time you think something, every time you do something, your brain changes because of it. So do you want to be the best worrier around, or do you want to be the best optimist around?
So for a fellow who suffered all through school, right through high school, with undiagnosed dyslexia, you've just finished your 29th book. Wow. That's retraining your brain, George.
It's when, as you know, when you receive a book from the publisher and they say, we want you to read this carefully, I just start laughing and I write them back a note and I say, do you know who you're asking to do this?
Well, if our readers of Lodestar get a fraction out of reading this of what I got out of working with you, George, I'll be very proud and they'll be very lucky because working with you on this project has been terrific. I'm so proud that you're my partner, but even prouder that you're my friend.
Jim, thank you so much. One of the things that I think made this project so wonderful for me is working with you. And my wife or the kids would say, what are you doing? And I said, well, I've got the meeting with Jim McCann, or I'm going to New York to work with Jim McCann. And they'd say, well, no offense, who's he? And I said, well, 800 Flowers. And they said, oh, he's a really successful businessman. And I've always said, Jim is a phenomenally successful entrepreneur and businessman, but it pales in comparison to the person that he is and the compassion that he has for other people. So this has not been just a privilege for me. It's been a part of my journey that I will look upon with great fondness.
We put our heart into everything we do. We are farmers, bakers, florists, and makers who grow and create with a passion. Made with love at every step of the way. Because at the end of the day, we know you're sending more than a gift. 1-800-Flowers, share with love.
Well, I hope you enjoyed what you heard, and I know I'll be sharing it forward. I hope you get to as well. Let's keep the conversation going. Follow me along on Twitter at Jim1800Flowers and on LinkedIn at Jim McCann. Hope to talk to you soon.